5 years ago, when Michael first came into our lives, he was just a wiry teenager with a guarded look in his eyes. I was 32 then, settled into what I thought was my version of adulthood. Career in marketing, a cute little apartment, a cat named Tilly, and a collection of houseplants I managed to keep alive. Life was steady, predictable. And then my sister, Laura, and her husband decided to foster. That's how Michael came into the picture. I remember the first time I met him. It was awkward, to say the least. He barely said 2 words to me, which wasn't surprising. He'd been through a lot, and trusting people didn't come easy for him. Still, there was something about him that struck me, even back then. Maybe it was the way he seemed to light up, just a little, when Laura's kids included him in their silly games. Or the way he quietly took care of their dog, Rex, like the animal's well-being was his personal mission. Fast forward 5 years, and Michael wasn't that kid anymore. He was 20 now, taller than me, with a quiet confidence that snuck up on you. He stayed close to Laura and her family, even after he aged out of the system. We all saw him as part of the family. I thought of him as my family too, or at least I did until I didn't. It sounds weird, doesn't it? Believe me, I wrestled with that. For the longest time, I couldn't figure out why I'd get this nervous flutter in my stomach whenever Michael came over to help me fix something at my place, or why my heart would skip when he'd crack a rare smile at one of my bad jokes. At first, I told myself it was nothing, that I was just proud of the man he was becoming. But then I started noticing the way he looked at me, like he saw me, really saw me. Not as Laura's sister or the woman who brought him cookies that one time, but as me, Jane. The first time he said something that crossed into more than friendly territory, I froze. It was a random Thursday evening. He'd come by to fix a leaky faucet in my kitchen. We were sitting on the couch afterward, sharing a pizza, when he casually said, "You know, you make it really hard not to like you." I laughed it off, of course. "Well, you're not so bad yourself," I said, thinking he meant it in that sibling-like, we've known each other forever way. But then he just looked at me. And I mean looked. Like he was trying to decide if he should say more. He didn't, but the air between us felt heavier after that. Over the next few months, those moments kept happening. A lingering glance here, a quiet compliment there. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. And the truth was, I didn't hate it. In fact, I started looking forward to seeing him, to hearing his thoughts about the latest movie or book, or whatever random topic came up. I started noticing little things about him. How his hands were always a little rough from working on cars. How he had this habit of running a hand through his hair when he was thinking. How his voice softened whenever he talked about something he cared about. One night, it all came to a head. We were sitting in my living room again, this time going through some old family photos Laura had asked me to organize. Michael picked up a picture of himself at 16, standing awkwardly between Laura and her kids. "I hated taking this," he said, laughing a little. "I thought I didn't belong." I looked at him and said, "You did belong. You still do." He put the photo down and turned to me. "Do I?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Because sometimes I feel like the only place I really belong is here, with you." My heart stopped. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to push him away, to tell him this was crazy and impossible. But another part of me, one I couldn't ignore anymore, wanted to say, "Stay." And so I did. I told him the truth. That I didn't know what this was or where it could go, but that I cared about him. That he mattered to me. And that maybe, just maybe, I felt the same way he did. It wasn't simple or easy after that. It couldn't be. Laura didn't take the news well when we told her, and there were plenty of awkward conversations with friends and family. But Michael was patient. He never pushed, never demanded anything I wasn't ready to give. And over time, we found our way. Looking back, I think the hardest part wasn't falling for him. It was letting myself believe that something so unconventional could be real. But it was. It is. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. It was late one evening, and the house was unusually quiet. Laura and her family were away on a weekend trip, leaving Michael and me to hold down the fort. I was curled up on the couch with a book, enjoying the solitude, when I heard it. Some faint, muffled noises coming from Michael's room down the hall. At first, I ignored it, chalking it up to him watching a movie or something. But as it went on, curiosity got the better of me. I walked toward his door, hesitating for a moment before deciding against knocking. Whatever it wasn't my business. But even as I turned to head back to the living room, I couldn't shake the weird feeling in my gut. I didn't sleep much that night, tossing and turning, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quite piece together. The next morning, when Michael had gone out to grab coffee, I found myself standing outside his room again. This time, I knocked softly. No answer. The door was slightly ajar, so I peeked in, telling myself I was just checking to make sure everything was okay. And that's when I saw it, the rumpled bedspread, a small pile of crumpled napkins on the nightstand. My stomach flipped as I quickly pieced together what had probably happened. I backed out of the room, my face worn with embarrassment. What was I even doing? This wasn't my place. I spent the rest of the day avoiding him, keeping myself busy with chores and errands. When he got back, he didn't seem to notice anything was off, which was a relief and also somehow frustrating. I felt like I was holding on to this strange, unspoken secret. That night, I was in my room, getting ready for bed. I just changed into a tank top and shorts, my hair pulled up into a messy bun, when there was a knock on my door. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. "Come in," I said instinctively, tucking the hem of my tank top down nervously. The door opened slightly, and there he was, Michael, standing in the doorway. He looked unsure of himself, almost hesitant, but there was something in his expression that stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't the same boyish charm I'd grown used to seeing. This was different. He looked serious and tense even, like he'd been carrying the weight of something he couldn't hold back anymore. "Michael?" I said, my voice wavering slightly as I turned to face him. "What's up?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped into the room, quietly closing the door behind him. That simple act sent my heart racing. This wasn't a casual visit, and I could feel the air shift between us. "I couldn't stop thinking about you," he said finally, his voice low and quiet, almost as though he was afraid someone might hear him. My breath caught in my throat. "What do you mean?" I asked, though deep down I already knew. "About you," he said, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made it hard to look away. "About us." His words hit me like a tidal wave, and I suddenly felt like I couldn't breathe. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of the moment, tried to figure out what to say. "Michael, we should." I started, but my voice faltered, the words getting caught somewhere between my head and my heart. Before I could finish, he crossed the room in a few quick steps. He was standing so close now, too close, and my skin tingled from the heat radiating off him. His eyes searched mine, and I could see the determination in them, the way he was working up the courage to say something that had clearly been building for a long time. "Jane," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I know this is complicated. I know how this looks, but I can't pretend anymore." "Pretend what?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "That I don't feel this," he said, his hand brushing lightly against my arm. The touch was soft, tentative, but it sent a jolt through me like lightning. That I don't want this. Us. I opened my mouth to respond, to say something, anything that would make this moment less overwhelming, but the words never came. Instead, he leaned in, his face inches from mine. His eyes locked on me as if silently asking for permission. And then his lips were on mine. It was a hesitant kiss at first, almost shy, like he wasn't sure if I'd push him away. But when I didn't, when I cooled it, he deepened it. His hand slid up to cup my cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against my skin, and I felt myself melt into him. It was like every unspoken word, every lingering glance, and every moment of tension from the past few months came rushing to the surface all at once. I kissed him back. I didn't even think about it. It was instinctive, a reaction I couldn't control. The kiss was soft and gentle, but filled with so much unspoken emotion, it felt like the world around us had disappeared. For that moment, it was just us, and nothing else mattered. Over time, his hand ran lower along my stomach, and I felt the warmth of his fingers. He moved smoothly and methodically, as if he had done this thousands of times. The sensations were incredible. Over time, the movements accelerated until I felt that it couldn't get better. When we finally pulled apart, my heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst out of my chest. The room felt electric, charged with an energy I'd never felt before. Neither of us spoke for a long moment, just standing there, staring at each other, our breaths coming in shallow, uneven bursts. "Michael," I whispered, my voice shaky and barely audible. "We can't do this." "Why not?" he asked, his voice steady despite the raw emotion in his eyes. "Tell me you don't feel it too." His words hung in the air, and I felt my throat tighten. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he was imagining things, that this was nothing more than a fleeting moment of confusion. But I couldn't, because the truth was, I did feel it too. I looked away, my eyes falling to the floor as I tried to gather my thoughts, to make sense of everything that was happening. "It's not that simple," I said finally, my voice trembling. "It doesn't have to be simple," he said, taking a step closer, closing the distance between us again. "It just has to be real. And this is real, Jane. I know you feel it too." I met his gaze again, and the intensity in his eyes made my breath catch. He was right. This was real. It was terrifying and overwhelming and completely unexpected, but it was real. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. So instead, I reached for him, pulling him into another kiss. This time, there was no hesitation, no second guessing. It was deep and urgent, and filled with everything we couldn't put into words. For that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the consequences, not the complications, not the world outside that door. It was just us, and for the first time in what felt like forever, everything felt right. A few days later, Michael suggested we go for a walk at the park. It felt like a safe idea, a way to spend time together without the intensity of being alone in the house. I agreed, trying to convince myself that I could keep things normal, that whatever had happened between us the other night was just a slip. But as we wandered through the trails, talking about everything and nothing, it was clear that normal wasn't on the table anymore. The sun was warm, the kind of day that makes everything feel a little brighter. We stopped for ice cream at a cart near the lake and then found a bench to sit on, watching kids feed ducks in couples, holding hands as they strolled by. The tension between us was palpable, even in the open air. At some point, I excused myself to use the bathroom. It was one of those small, standalone park toilets with just enough space for one person. As I shut the door behind me, I heard footsteps, quick and deliberate, approaching. "Jane," Michael's voice called through the door, low but urgent. "Michael, what are you?" I started, but before I could finish, the door swung open, and he slipped inside, shutting and locking it behind him. "Are you crazy?" I hissed, my voice barely above a whisper, glancing nervously at the door. "People are going to see." "I don't care," he said, his eyes locking onto mine with that same intensity that had been driving me insane for weeks. "I can't keep pretending around you, Jane." Before I could respond, he moved closer, his hands cupping my face as he kissed me. It was different this time, more urgent, more reckless. I should have pushed him away, should have told him this was too risky, too dangerous. But I didn't. Instead, I melted into him, my hands tangling in his hair as every bit of tension between us unraveled in that tiny, cramped space. Time lost all meaning. For what felt like forever, it was just us. No family, no rules, no fears. Just the heat of the moment and the sound of our breath mingling. It wasn't until we heard a knock at the door, followed by an irritated voice, that reality came crashing back. I bent over as much as possible and wanted to do it. It was a little awkward and uncomfortable. But from him, I could understand that he was delighted. This lasted several minutes. His body arched passionately, and then I heard, "Is someone in there?" There's a line. We froze, pulling apart like teenagers caught sneaking out. I glanced at Michael, and a look on his face, a mix of amusement and sheepishness, made me want to laugh and scream at the same time. "Just a minute," I called, my voice embarrassingly shaky. We tried to compose ourselves, smoothing our clothes and straightening our hair before finally unlocking the door. Sure enough, a small crowd had gathered, with a few people giving us suspicious looks. My face burned as I avoided eye contact, muttering an apology before practically bolting out of there. Michael followed close behind, grinning like it was the funniest thing in the world. Well, that was subtle, he teased, his voice low enough for only me to hear. I shot him a glare, but the corners of my mouth betrayed me, twitching upward despite my best efforts. "You're impossible," I muttered, shoving his arm lightly as we walked back toward the car. But even as I replayed the embarrassment in my mind, I couldn't deny the thrill of it, the reckless, messy, exhilarating feeling of being with him. And as much as I hated to admit it, I was starting to think I didn't want it to stop. The drive home was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that felt uncomfortable. It was loaded, filled with the weight of all the unspoken things hanging between us. Every now and then, Michael would glance over at me, and even though I kept my eyes firmly on the road, I could feel his gaze, heavy and insistent. My heart hadn't stopped racing since we left the park, and I could tell his hadn't either. When we pulled into the driveway, it was late. The sky was deep and starless, and the house was dark except for the faint glow of the porch light. We both got out of the car without a word, walking up the steps and into the house as though nothing unusual had happened. "I'm going to bed," I said, my voice too even, too controlled. Michael nodded, lingering near the stairs. "Good night," he said, his tone calm, but his eyes told a different story. I went to my room, shutting the door behind me and leaning against it with a sigh. My heart was still pounding, my mind racing with everything that had happened that day. The kiss in the park bathroom, the thrill of being so close to him, the way he looked at me like I was the only thing that mattered. I tried to push it all away, to focus on something else. I even changed into pajamas, brushed my teeth, and got into bed, determined to fall asleep and leave it all behind me. But of course, sleep didn't come. The house was too quiet, too still, and my thoughts wouldn't stop. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, the minutes dragging by as I replayed everything over and over in my head. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Before I even realized what I was doing, I was out of bed, my feet bare and silent on the cool hardwood floor as I crept down the hall. Michael's door was slightly ajar, just like it had been that morning, and a soft light spilled out into the hallway. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorframe. This was a terrible idea. I knew it was. But the pull I felt toward him was stronger than anything else. I nudged the door open and peeked inside. He was lying on the bed, propped up on one elbow, his phone in his hand. When he saw me, his face lit up in that way that always made my heart do this ridiculous little flip. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice soft, almost teasing. I stepped into the room, closing the door quietly behind me. "Not really," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He sat up, setting his phone down on the nightstand. "Me neither," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. For a moment, we just stood there, the air between us thick with tension. Neither of us moved, but the distance between us felt impossibly small, like a single step could bridge the gap and change everything. I didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him, maybe it was me. But suddenly I was in his arms, and his lips were on mine. The kiss was tentative at first, almost shy, like we were testing the waters. But it didn't stay that way for long. It deepened quickly, growing more urgent, more desperate, like we'd been holding back for too long and couldn't do it anymore. His hand slid around my waist, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, my fingers tangling in his hair. The room felt hot, charged with an energy that made my skin tingle and my heart race. We stumbled back toward the bed, still kissing, still tangled up in each other. He pulled me down beside him, his arms wrapping around me as though he was afraid I might slip away. His lips trailed down my neck, sending shivers through me, and I couldn't help the soft sigh that escaped my lips. He pressed tightly against my body, and I felt a strong warmth from below. A second later, it became much stronger. He moved like a snake. It was incredible. I felt his heavy breathing, his warmth. At that moment, my eyes darkened. Time lost all meaning. For hours, we stayed there, wrapped up in each other, stealing kisses like they were the only thing keeping us alive. The world outside didn't exist. There was no house, no family, no rules. Just us, tangled together in a mess of limbs and whispered words. It wasn't until the faint light of dawn started creeping through the blinds that reality began to set in. My heart sank as I realized how late it was, or how early. I pulled away slightly, my forehead resting against his. "I should go," I whispered, my voice hoarse from hours of kissing. He nodded reluctantly, his hand still resting on my waist. "I know," he said, his voice low and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Regret? Hope. I slipped out of his room, tiptoeing back to mine before anyone could catch us. The house was still quiet, but the stillness felt different now, charged, alive, like it was holding on to the echoes of what had just happened. As I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions: fear, guilt, excitement, and something deeper that I wasn't ready to name yet. Whatever this was between us, it wasn't simple. It wasn't easy, but it was real. And as terrifying as that was, I couldn't bring myself to regret it.